Good evening. Welcome to Community and Technology, where we connect the global community with news, information, and resources that we hope will help improve your life. I'm Stu Reid. I'll be your host tonight. My co-host Dave Burstein has the night off. Today we have a very special guest. She is an associate professor at the Annenberg School of Communication at the University of Pennsylvania. In Philadelphia, she works with the Creative Resilience Collective and the Workers' Solidarity Network. She's the author of the recently published The Gentrification of the Internet, How to Reclaim Our Digital Freedom. I'm pleased to welcome Jessa Lingel to the show. Welcome, Jessa.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, so the title of your book is very intriguing. Tell us about it. How'd you come to write it?
I started thinking about the idea of gentrification in terms of the internet when I was writing my last book, which is about Craigslist. And a lot of people hear Craigslist and have a very strong reaction. People often think that it's sort of an old school at best and kind of creepy at worst part of the internet. But when I was researching it, I found that it had a very different narrative, that for a lot of people, it was a lifeline for getting jobs, for finding apartments, and even for dating. And so when I was trying to make sense of that disconnect, I started thinking about the idea that some parts of the internet have been left behind, not because they don't work anymore and not because they don't have value, but just because our ideas of what the internet should look and feel like have changed. And that made a lot of sense to me as someone who has lived in many gentrifying neighborhoods where businesses and homes and schools suddenly start to seem backwards or out of date. But really nothing about them has changed. It's just other people with new ideas about what a neighborhood should look and feel like move in, and their ideas tend to win out, often because they have more money and more resources. So that's how the idea that gentrification isn't just a process that happens in city streets, but it was also an idea that happens that can help us think about the internet really came from.
Mm-hmm. Certainly, it resonates with me, that whole notion. When you look at how big tech money, and I know in one of your interviews you talked about, you compared Facebook to a big developer that comes in and bulldozes half the homes in the neighborhood and displaces people, and certainly kind of feel that way in terms of how the internet is kind of shaping up right now. Tell us about that and how you see it.
Sure. So when people talk about gentrification, sometimes they talk about it like it's just one or two people who move into a neighborhood and they're sort of like the tip of the iceberg. And it's really all just about individual consumers making choices about where to live. But actually, gentrification only happens if there's like structural changes that support or enable gentrification, right?
Mm-hmm.
I live in Philadelphia where we have all sorts of laws that really encourage developers to move in, to set up tax abatements, which are basically rules that newcomers pay less taxes than their neighbors. Meanwhile, folks who have been there much longer wind up paying higher taxes. So those kinds of rules are what make gentrification happen. It really isn't so much about individual people. And that's kind of the same thing that we see with online companies, these online, mega companies like Facebook and Google, Microsoft, Amazon, where it isn't so much about individual people. It isn't so much about like Mark Zuckerberg or, one individual actor. It's really about a whole structure that really enables these large companies to come in and have as much power as they do. So we could think about that in terms of a lack of regulation. We could think about that in terms of a lack of accountability for these folks. And that's something that you really see. It's a systematic level phenomenon. It's not an individual consumer phenomenon. So in terms of how gentrification plays out online, you can think of it a couple ways. There's some very direct, connections, like when a tech company sets up a headquarters in your neighborhood. So if you've ever been to San Francisco, lately, and if you've been there maybe say 15 years ago, you would notice this massive change. And that's because when tech companies come in, they bring all this money, and suddenly they really actively contribute to a process of gentrification. You know, rents go sky high. Old businesses that employ people from the neighborhood and serve people from the neighborhood get replaced by hipster coffee shops. So there's a very direct relationship between gentrification in the tech industry and on city streets. So I'm not even using a metaphor there. That's just describing what happens. But there is also another way where that happens in terms of what's called digital redlining. And so that's a process where Facebook shows ads to some groups of people over than others. So if I want to target, if I'm an ad, if I want to buy an ad and I really want to target, you know, new moms between the ages of 35 and 40 who like vegetarian food, I can do that. Now that one you might say, no big deal. Advertisers have always gone for something. But what if you're targeting housing ads or real estate ads or real estate loans, and you're excluding people of color and only targeting to rich white folks? That's what I mean by digital redlining, which is a total replication of the property and real estate redlining we saw in the United States from, say, the 1950s to a lot more recently than some folks would believe. So there's a lot of times where I'm talking about gentrification in like a metaphorical way, but there's other ways where it's just like a direct correlation between what is happening online and what is happening in city streets.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, as you talk about digital redlining, the other piece is, you know, there are a lot of folks that don't have access, either not available, but more often, particularly in urban Black and Brown communities, the affordability issue. And you know, right here in New York City, where I work, you have a public housing community of almost 600,000 people, half of which don't have internet at home. And that's largely related to affordability, as well as you know, applicability. You know, not having or not being aware of how the internet can actually improve people's lives. And you know, I work with a number of groups. Our group called Digital Divide Partners. We work with resident associations and we help develop applications and services that ride on the internet so folks can see, oh, I can do this, oh, I can do that. But again, you know, if that doesn't happen, folks don't know. And just like the real estate metaphor, where you can't buy housing in certain areas, you can't get mortgages. A lot of folks that just can't get internet because of their circumstances, not because it's not quote unquote available, but because of their economic and social economic situation, they just can't get it. So yeah, I think it's a powerful parallel, just metaphorically and actually, the way you break that down in terms of, you know, the gentrification and the stratification of the internet. I think our co-host may be joining us, Dave Burstein. We'll see if he's there. Oh, there he is. Okay, Dave Burstein, let me introduce you to Jessa Lingel. Jessa, this is Dave Burstein, my co-host, who in fact made it to the studio.
Can you hear me?
We hear you fine.
Hi.
Welcome, Dave.
Hello. Sorry about that. It was one of the 2-hour waits in the doctor's office that tied me up.
Well, real life happens sometimes. We're just talking with Jessa.
What I missed.
We're just talking with Jessa about her book, The Gentrification of the Internet. And the gentrification part, the tagline, how to reclaim our digital freedom. We haven't gotten to that part yet, but we're talking about the gentrification of the internet. And Jessa was running down some real strong parallels between real estate redlining, real estate gentrification, and digital gentrification and digital redlining. And you know, I was just kind of sharing with her some of our experience here, Dave, with so many New Yorkers in public housing that cannot afford internet access, even though it is quote unquote available. You got hundreds of thousands of folks who don't have it and who are omitted from the whole digital revolution because of that. So I think it's very powerful metaphor and comparison.
Yeah, there may be good news for all of them, or almost all of them. The Senate bill that passed, or is about to pass, has a $30 a month subsidy for people of a certain income. That is more than enough to get a decent internet connection from the cable company that is already in most of the housing in New York. That almost definitely will go through the House. And there is a $50 subsidy available now as emergency broadband that's fairly easy to qualify for. And that is a good thing because it's going to be an effective way for the people who can't afford to pay to get a decent internet connection.
Mm-hmm.
Stu, you remember we had Scott Walston on the show?
Yeah, the economist who talked about how, in particular, Jessa, one of the notions that gets kicked around a lot is that if you have multiple broadband providers in a given market, the pricing is going to go down. And Scott Wallerstein, who's an economist, and studied that and demonstrated that that just does not happen. The service providers tend to collude either consciously or unconsciously, implicitly or explicitly, and coalesce around a given price point that they're all comfortable with, and they don't compete on price. So the federal program that Dave is talking about is going to be a big help, as well as the one that's already, in fact, the Emergency Broadband Benefit Program. So that starts to speak to the accessibility issue. I'd like Jenna to talk a little bit more, Dave, before you got on. She was also talking about how the big tech companies and others like Amazon and et cetera, how they dominate the landscape of Facebook.
Yeah.
I mean, of the
all
internet.
Around the world.
Yeah, in much the way that big housing developers come in and dominate and take over a neighborhood. And just because you can afford to buy internet is not going to change that at all. So I'm interested in hearing some from Jessa about her piece on how to reclaim our digital freedom. Jessa, what are some of your thoughts on that?
Well, I'm glad you brought up the digital divide issue, though, because a lot of people think of that as a rural problem. Like the problem is like the last mile problem, like how are we going to get internet to these folks in rural areas? But it's actually, if you're looking at broadband access as opposed to access through your cell phone, it is very difficult to get broadband access to a lot of folks because of cost. And it's great that this bill is moving forward. Then the problem is going to be, publicizing that to the folks who are most in need. I do also think that in the book I talk about, there is also a way where ISPs have gentrified in that we used to have, peak year for ISPs was 2001, where we had over 7,000 ISPs in this country. It was a time of incredible consumer choice. And now most folks are really only able to choose from one or at most two. I appreciate the view that that doesn't necessarily, having more competition doesn't drive down price necessarily. But other factors are also at play where they're not just competing for things like price, but you could also be competing over things like privacy policies. So some ISPs are more pro net neutrality and some take a strong view on user privacy. So there's that kind of component. I suspect you also have less price colluding when you're talking about small mom and pop ISPs versus much larger ISPs like Comcast. So all those issues are at play. The main thing really, though, is that they should be more regulated. That we should just have, hopefully under this new administration, we have an FCC that is going to take a stronger stance on regulating these companies. Because right now, your
hasn't been really very
sell
strong
your data to third parties. So.
Was that Dave? I missed that, Dave. Dave had a comment.
Yeah, you're being a little bit optimistic about what's going to happen in this administration based on what you believe in. Jessica is very much being political about it.
It's the FCC chairman you're talking about.
Yeah, Jessica Rosenworcel is limiting the battles she wants to fight. So she's not in general. In fact, on the record, she is opposed to regulation as much as possible and intends to only use it when necessary. It's unlikely she's going to stick her neck out on any of the issues that you're thinking of, except maybe requiring the ISPs to be open about what their pricing and policies are. She's not likely to enforce very much. Washington may look a little bit about privacy, but you say you think we need more regulation. There's lots of different things that could be regulated. What are the things you think that would make a difference?
Things that I think would make a difference. Well, for one thing, I get accused of being optimistic all the time, but there's no other way I could get out of bed in the morning. So I just am militantly optimistic in my views on big tech, because otherwise I would just be writing the same cynical stuff as everybody else.
Stay closer to the microphone, turning your head away.
I'll do my best. But in terms of the regulation, I mean, I'm reasonably... There's been some movement about antitrust. I think I would love to. I think that would really make a difference, is breaking up the big tech companies, particularly Amazon and Facebook and Google. We'll see if that pans out right now. I mean, I'm definitely more impressed by the Senate hearings in, say, the last year than I was in 2017, 2018, that Mark Zuckerberg went before the Senate, and there was that famous exchange where Orrin Hatch revealed that he had no idea how Facebook worked. If you listened to the antitrust hearings over the past year, the questions have been much more informed. The viewpoints have been much more nuanced. So at the very least, the Senate is not as embarrassing in terms of the questions they ask or the sort of knowledge that we gain. So antitrust is certainly one area. The other area would just be to have something that looks something more like the GDPR in the EU, where consumers just have more rights around their own privacy. The GDPR has its own problems, but it would be a huge step. So those are some of the things where I think regulation could help, much like regulation would help a lot around housing policy when trying to prevent urban gentrification.
Let me just insert, GDPR is general data, I think I'm saying general data privacy regulation, which is in effect in the European Union, and pretty strong regulations around privacy.
It only looks pretty strong compared to what we have in the US.
Okay, well,
compared to what it could be, it's not.
The benchmark.
Pretty weak. Yeah.
I think Dave has a bit more of a cynical view on regulation and where tech is going. Dave?
Well, not necessarily. I'm not necessarily cynical. Jessa, do you know Tim Wu?
Yes.
Tim is apparently calling most of the shots on this now. And he's brought in to the FTC somebody very strong from Yale that he's worked with. So the people in the Biden administration are very strong wanting to use antitrust. The stock market thinks it's a joke and they're not going to get anywhere. We see two companies over $2 trillion in value at this point. I haven't looked today, but last week they were. And Facebook stock has been exploding lately, so that the people with money think that the antitrust things that we're talking about aren't going to get anywhere. It's very hard to see where the courts are going to come down. There was a major suit that was thrown out of court, and the FTC is going back in with more data, trying to get it there. There's no question that people like Tim and to the extent I know the attitudes of the other people in the Biden administration.
Hey, Dave, tell our audience just briefly about Tim Wu, for those who are not familiar with him, and what role he's playing in the Biden administration.
Yeah, we've never had Tim on the show, but we're here in New York, and I've known Tim a long time, even back when he was on Virginia. Tim Wu is most famous for coining the term net neutrality. He did that with Larry Lessig, and what that was about is trying to take what we wanted of keeping control away from the telcos who own the networks and requiring them to be neutral. And it was they looked at how you could turn that into law. And that became the notion of net neutrality, which has been abused in many different ways, including very effectively by some of the lobbyists for AT&T that has confused most of Washington about what it means. Tim has gone on to look at concentration in depth and antitrust. He's a Columbia professor now. He took a year off to work with New York State, which resulted in what could be a landmark case against the cable companies, that the states do have that they could not ignore ordinary state regulations on things like false advertising and fraud, even if the FCC does have authority over some things. He's brilliant, sharp as a whit, and is in the White House right now.
What is his position in the White House, Jay?
I think they created a post that called him senior advisor on something.
Okay,
But,
so he's a technology advisor essentially to the president.
yeah, but what I'm hearing from somebody, Jonathan Adelstein, who was in the middle of the debate of the infrastructure stuff, because he was one of the very few lobbyists for the industry who happens to be a Democrat. And he said, oh yeah, that Tim's saying this and Tim's saying that. So he's apparently pulling the shots on most of this stuff. So yes, the people inside the Biden administration are very strong. They do not have a majority in Congress at this point. The Congress is split 50-50, and several of the key congressmen are not ready to support the antitrust that the administration would like to bring. And of course, we know what the US judiciary is like now. So it's hard to see what will work out. They certainly will try to enforce it. One of the things that Tim did in his work on antitrust was look at the antitrust law itself. And Tim took the position. Do you know this stuff, Jessa? Is this
Yeah,
something?
I have a whole argument about antitrust in the book, which cites Tim's new book, Gilded Age.
Yeah. So why don't I let you take over since you're the guest and you describe this, because you probably know it better than I do.
Oh, I don't know about that. I mean, the main argument that I make is the same argument a lot of folks are making, including, Tim Wu, but also Elizabeth Warren.
You're turning your head away from the mic and I don't hear you. So keep looking at us.
Okay. The same argument I make in the book has been made by other folks like Tim Wu, but also Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, which is simply that the tech companies are too big, that they're big in the same way as the robber barons. And the last time we had major, robust antitrust regulation at the federal level. Antitrust laws have been interpreted differently since, say, the 1980s, and now there's a push to sort of go back to some of the earlier understandings of antitrust, which actually had much stronger protections for consumers rather than companies. And Tim Wu's recent book certainly helped me understand that more. So. And, other folks like Siva Vaidyanathan's book on Facebook, there's a bunch of people making these arguments. And it's just, as you were saying, it's too soon to tell. The Supreme Court has come down in sometimes unpredictable ways when it comes to corporate interests. So we'll sort of see how that pans out. But again, with my militant optimism, I choose to be hopeful that we'll see some meaningful change. One argument that I make in the book is that what really unites a lot of these companies isn't anything technological. It's actually their resistance to regulation. what would be very meaningful is if we stopped calling some of these companies tech companies and started thinking of them as anti-regulation companies. There's nothing particularly technologically interesting about Airbnb. There's nothing particularly technologically interesting about Uber. What's really the thing that they share is a resistance to regulation and a commitment to sort of, their own ideas about, a California ideology, or the idea that the world's social problems can be solved through technology, but really calling them out on their resistance to regulation and sort of insisting that the federal government has a role to play, I think could meaningfully change how people experience the internet in terms of whether they feel they have any power to push back on these companies that have simply gotten too big.
And listeners should know that I have extreme bias on these subjects and have said so publicly in a few places. Most of what you hear when it gets down to the nitty-gritty of the debate, I know the FCC pretty well, I've covered it for 20 years, is small changes, what I think of as small changes. And unfortunately, the power of the internet giants is so extreme. I don't think small changes are going to be the key thing. And that you have to do something very dramatic, such as bust up Facebook into 3 companies, to really have something that affects our experience. So I'm right with Jessa saying you need to do more, and I'm very disappointed about what people I respect, like Tom Wheeler, who was the last head of the FCC under Obama, are talking about, which are compromises that will improve things. But my gut, when I look at the details, is they won't improve things enough to make the difference. That's unfortunate, but I'm just throwing that in not to argue or any of it, but just because I think listeners should know the bias of the people that they're hearing on the air. Stu, why don't you take it a few minutes as I take a break and get...
Yeah, we're going to take a break. You're listening to Community and Technology on WHCR 90.3, the voice of Harlem. This is Stu Reid and Dave Burstein with a very special guest, Jessa Lingel, author of the recently published The Gentrification of the Internet, How to Reclaim Our Digital Future. Our digital freedom, rather. We're going to take a brief musical break and be back in a few minutes. Okay, we're back. This is Community and Technology with Stu Reid and Dave Burstein, and very special guest today, Jessa Lingel. Before the break, we were talking about possibility of breaking up some of the technology and other corporate giants that are so dominating the internet landscape. And Jessa is a militant optimist, which I certainly respect. And Dave Burstein is maybe a clear-eyed realist in terms of his observational history over the last couple of decades with all the goings on in Washington. And Dave, do please unmute yourself. We were talking about what government can and might do. I'm wondering, and Jessa, I don't know if you talk about this in your book, but what's your thinking about what people can do, either individually or collectively? Is there anything that we can do to push back to reclaim our digital freedom?
So I spent a lot of time looking at how activists have pushed back on gentrification and urban gentrification, and thinking about how that could translate into online tactics. So one problem that I talk about in the book is the way that online platforms sort of sort us into these algorithmic piles, and then instead of being exposed to different viewpoints, which is one of the earliest hopes about the internet, we're increasingly exposed only to people who already agree with us. So rather than the internet saying, hey, here's a video on climate change as a hoax and another video on climate change is real, if you go look for a video on climate change as a hoax on YouTube, you will only find more videos about climate change as a hoax. So one thing that we can do is sort of be our own algorithms and take deliberate steps to diversify our online social media feeds. So I don't think it's particularly useful to tell people to disengage from social media. Most people who have that luxury have already done so. The students I teach, many of them are looking for jobs where they're required to have 500 LinkedIn friends. They're required to have 10,000 followers on Instagram before they can get a job in PR, before they can get a job as a journalist. So we can't tell people just to get offline. So then the question becomes, what can we do online that would actually make us feel like we have more control? And I call that being your own algorithm. So taking steps to diversify your network. So for example, the only social media platform I use is Tumblr. And on Tumblr, I went and I decided I'm going to follow a bunch of Black women comedians. And those are not people who are being sent to me with my previous interests of, libraries and bikes and vegan cooking. But what happened when I started following all of these Black women comedians is, first of all, my feed got a lot funnier. And second of all, I learned all these things about Black culture, about comedian life, about women's comedian lives as comedians that I never would have been exposed to before. And that really goes back to what the earlier vision of the internet could be. And so just taking small steps to diversify our networks can really push back on some of the isolation and siloing that we're seeing in mainstream social media platforms. There are people who always roll their eyes when I say this next thing, but it's actually really important. Call your congressperson, and call your senator. And that actually matters for stuff like, does your congressperson, does your senator, do your state representatives support things like net neutrality? Do they support things like antitrust regulation for big tech? I don't have that much luck when I call my senators, but I have a lot of luck when I call my state rep offices, and a lot of luck when I call my congressperson in terms of talking to a real human. And that making those phone calls is the only way that I've really been able to keep up with what they actually plan to vote on. And so I know it can feel a little deflating to be like, oh, that's all I'm going to do is call my representatives. But I promise it does actually feel like the most engaged way to understand what policymakers are doing and thinking in a way that happens at the local level. And that's the last thing I'll share is I have really recommitted in my activist life to local politics. I was very moved in Philadelphia. We're lucky to have a city councilwoman named Helen Gim. And in the height of the Trump years, when someone was asking her, what's the point of being a city council rep, she said, Scott Pruitt can be in charge of the EPA and we can still pass city-based laws that make our rivers cleaner. You know, Betsy DeVos can be head of the secretary, she can be Secretary of Education, and we can still do things to make schools in Philadelphia better. And it really changed my thinking about where we should be spending time. And there's a local counterpart to that, which is, again, what can you do to make sure that your city council people are arguing for fairer laws around broadband access, around ISPs, and what are the local initiatives that you can support, like mesh networks, for example, that would actually give people more control, more ownership over the internet in a lived, grounded way.
I like that. I especially like the first thing that you said, taking control of your own algorithms, because you know there's so much that's pushed at us. And you know, I've said this for the longest. I've been saying this about media in general, going back, because I have a video and TV production background that goes back decades. And I've always said to my friends and family, you got to take control of this media. You just can't let it bombard you, because it will. And it will take control of your thinking, consciously, subconsciously, and you don't even know it. And certainly the same thing is true of the internet. And I really like your idea of your notion of taking control of your own algorithm and consciously seeking out particular kinds of information and data that maybe is not fed to you based on your searching and history on the internet. I think that's a powerful idea. Dave, what would you say about that?
Well, I can give you lots of examples of how this kind of thing can work on the local level, among others. Here in New York, I understand there's some folks called the Digital Divide Partners who are actually active in many of the housing projects in New York and worked also in South Bronx and lots of places, making things happen. And that, of course, is Stu's outfit. And right now, the city government is trying to support that kind of work, supported Stu for a while. And Stu, why don't you take a moment and talk about the work you were able to do when you had government support?
Well, you know, my group, Digital Divide Partners, we go back a couple of decades, and government support. We had the support of New York State back in, I guess around 2009, I believe it was. We got a major grant from New York State to provide free and affordable broadband access, utilizing fiber and wireless hybrid network, delivering service to public housing residents and also low-income families. And the state helped subsidize the construction of the service, as well as the subsidize the service itself for the families. And we ended up with something like about 600 or 700 nodes around the city, in Harlem, in the South Bronx, and in Brooklyn as well. And that's around the time that Dave and I hooked up, and Dave did a story about us, about the amazing unknown wireless network. We didn't do a lot of publicity at the time because our focus was providing the service. It wasn't to beat the drum about who we were or what we were doing, but to provide the service. And we did that. And along the way, we partnered with resident groups, resident associations. A young man, John Johnson, who was a big vocal leader in the South Bronx, who has since passed away, was a very prominent leader in bringing technology services to public housing communities. And he helped focus a lot of the things that we did. I mentioned earlier, Jessa, about applications and services that help folks really connect with broadband. And one of the first things that this guy, John Johnson, came up with, he noticed that some of the senior ladies were afraid to come into the lobbies at certain times of day or evening, either from their upstairs down the elevator or from outside, because they weren't sure what was going on. A lot of kind of riffraff hanging out in the hallways, in the lobbies. So he asked, could we put in a camera? So we did that, and he said, can you make it so that everybody can see it? And what he essentially invented, and he came up with the name Virtual Tenant Patrol, because at the time previously, there used to be folks, generally elder ladies, sitting at a table in the lobby that were there to monitor who comes in and out. I mean, sitting right in harm's way, and who knows what the heck they were going to do if there was a problem, but they were the tenant patrol. So the resident leader came up with this whole idea of a virtual tenant patrol, where we put in cameras and the residents themselves are able to view the cameras in real time. And it was brilliant. And the effect was that all of the knuckleheads and the folks that wanted to cause trouble, they didn't want their mothers and their grandmothers and the aunties looking at them, hanging out and causing mischief. So they would take their nonsense elsewhere. And that was the whole idea. Not that it eliminated mischief, but it removed it from that particular community and from those areas. And that was just one of the very first examples of a resident-created application that we put on the broadband that helped really a lot of folks who never, and this is probably about 15 years ago, who didn't even know what the internet or broadband was, but we put it on and made it available on their phones and on their tablets, and all of a sudden you had these senior ladies looking at the internet and looking at what's going on in their buildings, and it was transformative. And we're still doing that today. And we've expanded our partnership, and now we're looking to, in partnership with our resident groups, to bring more broadband and these services to the entire Harlem and Northern Manhattan community. We have a project called Manhattan North Broadband that we are promoting, and that we've asked the city to help support with funding and other resources. And we hope it's going to be a model for resident engagement and resident cooperative ownership of the networks and the services. So it's the residents themselves, in partnership with our community-based technology group, that are providing these services and are building these networks. And we think it's a model that at least can be replicated here in New York City and throughout public housing. I don't know about the rest of the country, but here we're making it work. We have very active and engaged and really just smart residents who really are kind of just taking this by the horns and making it happen. So we've been really excited about the work that we've been doing. Dave has been watching us for about 15, maybe 20 years. And it seems like finally the rest of the world is starting to catch up with us. I've gotten involved, thanks to Dave's help, with the Internet Society, which is an organization that believes the internet is for everyone. Dave and I are both on the local chapter on the board of directors here in New York City, and or New York State, I guess. And they are helping us to promote the whole notion of what we're doing. And the Internet Foundation has, in fact, provided some funding for us to help expand our network and our community streaming stations. One of the other things, Jessa, that applications that we kind of stumbled upon, thanks to the residents again, was we heard from them, you never hear any good stories about what's going on in public housing. Every story is negative. It's about, the trash or the lead or whatever. And so they said, how can we create our own stories? So we have created with them community streaming stations where we and they together produce news and information, conversations, roundtable discussions about positive stuff that's going on and ways to address some of the issues that are going on in the community. So we've been doing that for about 4 or 5 years. And that's something that has really kind of caught on. And again, it drives broadband adoption. It's a reason for folks to use the technology. It's, all of a sudden the technology has some real relevance to their lives. Because one of the things that you probably know this, Jess, I know Dave does, folks that are financially challenged, it's difficult to set aside money for something that you don't really quite know the value of. And if I don't really understand the value of broadband in my home. I may have it on my phone, I may have the internet on my phone, but why do I need it at home? The pandemic helped kind of emphasize, some of that with the need for the remote learning and the video conferencing that all of a sudden became so important during the pandemic. But still, we need applications and services that really resonate with folks to help them pick up the technology and use the technology. And as they do that, they themselves help discover and develop new ways and new applications and services. So it's been a real learning experience for me and our group, my partner, Doug Frazier, who's been working with together with me for several decades and along this journey. We've learned a lot from the residents and really happy to be involved in expanding our service here in New York City, and particularly with the Manhattan North Project. Dave, you got me talking more than I wanted to talk about what I'm doing. We're kind of down to our last few minutes, so I want to hand it back to Jessa for any final comments and wrap up about her book and about what she sees, and in particular, Jessa, what how do you read the landscape over the next 5-10 years? What do you see?
Well, one thing I just want to say, what's so powerful about the project you're working on is that it's community driven rather than provider driven. Because here in Philadelphia, Comcast has been, saying, well, we're going to bring broadband access to underserved urban communities. One thing I know is you can't rely on like corporations to continue providing a service that you need in the long term. Like you want to provide a service for a short term, sure, look at a corporation, trying to boost their public image. But if you want long-term access to resources, it's better to have it be community driven, because then the actual community members have control of it. I'm working with a project here in Philadelphia Community Wireless Project, where we're trying to build community-owned, community-installed, community-stewarded mesh network broadband access. And I think that's super important, because then the actual technology reflects the same social control. So in terms of what I see happening in the next 5 to 10 years, I think we might actually see a breakup of some of these big tech companies because of antitrust legislation. But I also think, we're going to see increasing fragmentation of social media platforms, just because Gen Z has a short attention span for platforms. Gen Z has no problem moving from Instagram to TikTok to whatever comes next. So I think that that's going to change the landscape in a different way in terms of big providers versus small providers. No one would have seen the control that TikTok has had in the last, say, 18 months. So we might see more fragmentation in the social media landscape that way. And I think we're also going to see, digital activism that we've seen for the last 30 years, but really appeal to a larger and larger section of the country. And I think that that's where I have a lot of my hope too. And that people are going to use these tools in ways that tech companies never imagined. And that's always exciting. That's always something hopeful.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay. Dave, any final words? We got about a minute left.
Most people listening to this will qualify for $50 a month subsidy under emergency broadband, and that's enough to get you a decent commission. You definitely should use it and get yourself connected. It's not that hard. Probably do a couple of polls on how to do it. That now is in the Senate to go on for 5 years of funding. Go for it.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Unfortunately, will probably kill your response to the mesh that you're putting together, Jessa. Because when people can get the good commercial stuff that works, it's really hard to inspire them to do more work to get it another way. Excuse me, if they already can get something that works well. So we'll see.
Yeah, well, we're going to continue to focus on the community stuff for all the reasons that you outlined, Jess. And let me just put in a quick shameless plug for Digital Divide Partners, ddpny.org, can learn more about some of the work that we're doing here in New York City. This has been Community and Technology with Dave Burstein and Stu Reid, and our very special guest today has been Jessa Lingel, author of the recently published The Gentrification of the Internet, How to Reclaim Our Digital Freedom. Jessa, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me.
Okay, thanks. Okay, that's it for us on Community and Technology, WHCR 90.3 FM, the voice of Harlem. Stay tuned next week for more on Community and Technology. Thanks for tuning in.